air campaign against Iraq and the military might of Saddam Hussein began in the early hours of January the 17th, 1991. It was designed to take out key military and logistical targets in order to neutralize the country's will to fight. Drew Nichols was due to fly in the third bombing mission of the night to destroy 2 chemical weapons factories.
The day started out pretty much normally like I always do. I got up, I can't remember now, 10 o'clock-ish in the morning, went out and I ran my 2.5 miles, came back, just kind of wandered around, noticed a lot of hustling, bustling around the area, but didn't think much of it. And then somebody came up to it and goes, "Hey, did you hear? We're going." I go, "Oh, where are we going?" He goes, "You idiot, we're going to war tonight." I go, "Well, gee, I guess I have to go take a shower then." I went and sat down, wrote a letter to my wife going, you know, this could be it. You know, I love you. Thanks for being married to me for 4 months. And, but here I go off to war.
While other pilots prepared for takeoff, Drew had hours of waiting before his solo mission began.
I didn't take off till 1 o'clock in the morning. So I actually had a chance to go back over to our compound where we ate dinner and watch the first wave of the war on CNN.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
We got over there and said, yep, bombs work, the planes work.
In Baghdad, people rushed to safety to escape the bombs that came from a silent enemy. At the coalition bases in Saudi Arabia, the troops expected retaliation from Saddam. They took refuge in bunkers like these.
I was down in my bunker around 2 o'clock in the morning and the phone rings. I pick it up. The war started. And I'm a little excited. I sort of wake up the colonel and he goes, "Yes, I know." I'm like, okay, so he didn't want to tell me.
The platoon sergeant came to us and told us we needed to get in full chemical gear and go to the bunker because the war started. And so I panicked and a couple other people panicked, and we helped. Everybody got in their stuff and in their chemical gear and went out to the bunker. So it was just a matter of sitting there waiting. It was like a moment where reality hit. You realize, oh my God, I could die.
We crossed the border. Now, of course, we're in our quote-unquote stealth mode, lights off. Radio dead also, so it's kind of like submarines, run silent, run deep there. And so here we go. We're quiet, we're dark, and we can't see anything.
In the first 7 hours of the air campaign, 750 sorties were flown over Iraq.
When I came off that target, I go, well, this going to war stuff is pretty easy. Nobody's shooting at me. The stealth mode works. Nobody saw me. I'm golden. I can do this forever.
For most Baghdad residents, the raids were nightly nightmares.
The sky become just a ball of flames, a big ball of flames. You didn't see the airplane. You just feel the sound passing over you, but you see nothing. And then the bomb, the explosion.
The coalition troops back in Saudi Arabia continued their claustrophobic imprisonment.
Just sitting there in the bunker, it was just torturous. Just the sheer thought of sitting there not knowing if your life is getting ready to end. It'd be like watching a satellite come straight towards you or a meteor come straight towards you and not know if it's gonna veer off or if it's gonna hit you. It just, that sheer anticipation is enough to kill you.
Drew Nichols' second target was not as easy as his first. He flew towards it with a false sense of security.
I look off in the distance and I see this kind of glow, and I'm going, boy, I wonder what that is down there. Then as I get closer and closer, I realize that's AAA, the anti-aircraft artillery. And I'm going, boy, somebody's getting the crap shot out of them. I hope that's, or I'm glad that's not me. AAA, it looks like the biggest fireworks display you can ever think of, and that's what you're trying to fly through. I tried to look for a place to go through, tried to get skinny. I tried to picture poking a pencil through all the AAA and see whether I could fit through there. I prayed to God and said, get me through this, and went right through the AAA, dropped my weapon, hit my target, and climbed as fast as I could to my exit altitude.
Within minutes of it starting, news of the air war was beamed across the world.
This operation will be one of the most ferocious airstrikes ever seen in the history of warfare.
Saddam Hussein was reportedly making a speech saying that this is the beginning of the war. The Islamic Holy Jihad, the Holy War, has just started. There were curtains of anti-aircraft fire.
The ground troops could only stand and wait.
I remember looking back in the desert, looking up and seeing the huge American bombers just going, and they looked so peaceful, and I thought, what sort of carnage and devastation they're going to wreak at the far end, you know. And at that stage, I felt a little bit sorry for the Iraqis.
You look up, and you can just see red lights going north. Just hundreds of red lights going north. Seeing all those planes go north, we knew it was the beginning.
It was not, though, the beginning of the end. 5 more weeks of airstrikes would try to bomb Saddam Hussein into submission. The airstrikes against Iraq were relentless. The big fear was that Saddam would reply with chemical weapons. The new buzzword was Scud.
Everything we'd heard about Saddam's army was that it was the 4th largest army in the world. They were extremely well equipped, they were extremely well trained, and the big thing that everybody was banging on about was Scud, 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 Scud.
If chemical weapons were going to be used, it would be the dreaded Scud missile that delivered them.
I wasn't scared of getting shot. I wasn't scared of getting blown up. But the biggest fear I had was doing what we call the floppy chicken, being gassed. That was my personal biggest fear.
Despite nuclear, biological, and chemical training courses, NBC courses, the troops' fears lingered.
Some of the things we were told about these nerve agents, just a drop of it gets on your skin and you're gone. We constantly had people coming to our units with new briefings to tell us exactly what these things would do to us. It was on everybody's mind.
NBC suits were issued to all troops to combat anything that Saddam could throw at them.
It's very claustrophobic. You put it on, it's warm, it's very warm. The charcoal gets on you and gets on your face and your body. And pretty soon, after a couple days of wearing this, it gets pretty nasty.
The respirator makes living extremely uncomfortable. When you're wearing the respirators, your performance becomes degraded, and the degradation is equated to the amount of time that you're in the respirator. Your performance declines.
The NBC courses taught the troops how to fight in their respirators and suits, as well as how to protect themselves from any lethal bombardment.
You could win a war with nuclear biological warfare. You don't even have to fire a shot anymore. You could send a rocket over, and within an hour, you could take the old enemy forces out with nuclear, biological, or chemical warfare. So if you haven't done the training and you're not happy with your training, then you're going to have to get brush up on it, because the threat was there, and we were quite 100% certain that he was going to use it.
The threat of chemical weapons remained the great unknown of the war until the very end. It struck terror into the people that had opposed Saddam Hussein and lived within range of the Scud missile.
The media were always around trying to cover the campaign. One of the questions I was always asked was, well, what are we going to do if they use chemical weapons against you? And of course, I didn't have a clue. I'd never had the opportunity to ask the president what we were going to do if they used chemical weapons against us. But I lied every time. I would say, the consequences will be so horrible for them if they use chemical weapons that I can't imagine they would ever contemplate it. You know?
Saddam Hussein couldn't compete with Allied power. He couldn't hit back directly and hope to win, but he could play on the fear that his Scuds inspired. The day after the war started, Saddam targeted Tel Aviv. He believed that the coalition was fragile and that if he could draw Israel into the conflict, the Arab states would abandon the war. Respirators were issued to all Israeli citizens and to the press.
We think they're only using conventional warheads, not chemical, but it's too early to say. We're waiting for the state radio to give us some instructions to take off this equipment before we can go out there and find out just what has happened.
The Americans had put pressure on Israel not to retaliate, but they knew there was a limit to Israel's restraint.
Israel is not a participant. Israel is not a combatant. And this man is elected to launch a terroristic attack against the population centers in Israel with no military design whatsoever.
Scuds were notoriously inaccurate, but even a Scud couldn't miss a whole country.
If you're tossing these things, so to speak, into a city, as was the case with Israel, even if they're off by half a mile, they still can cause a great deal of damage and a great deal of fear.
Scuds caused few deaths, but they were highly publicized. At one point, it seemed inevitable that Israel would retaliate. It rarely ignored attacks on its people. In return for American Patriot missiles, which would shoot down the Scuds, Israel promised to try its best to stay out of the war. But the Patriots never hit as many Scuds as was hoped. Scuds often fell apart in the air, creating multiple targets which were difficult for the Patriot to hit. Despite this, the Israelis did keep out of the war.
They sat back and took this, and it wasn't easy to take, and stayed out of this, because had they entered, I think the coalition could have fractured, or probably would have fractured, and then we would have been left with a mess.
RAF pilot John Peters and his navigator John Nichol were preparing for their first mission of the war. Tornado pilots were skilled at low-flying sorties. Peters' mission was to knock out an Iraqi airfield.
We were going in, and just at about, I suppose, about 40, 50 seconds out from the target, suddenly on the right-hand side of the aircraft, you got a big puff of black smoke. On the left-hand side, a big puff of black smoke. And you suddenly see anti-aircraft fire, and that really, it doesn't so much unnerve you, but it really, bloody hell, people are shooting at us. Suddenly, this huge kind of sort of hand of God just smacked the aircraft across the desert. I mean, we're talking 25 tons of metal, and it was just like floating in the wind, like this sort of sycamore seed. John started screaming, we're on fire, and I said, I know we're on fire. This wall of flame was just sort of marching towards us, and it was about 12 feet behind me. And that's why John was shouting, because he sits 6 feet behind me. 3, 2, 1, eject, eject, eject. It's a quarter-second delay, and it really feels an awful long time. And then it's as if you have this big giant who sort of grabs you by the shoulders and just throws you out the cockpit. And you get all the rocket noise and the sound. The canopy opens with a jolt. And we ejected so low, the next thing you know is the ground just jumps up, you hit the ground. and it's just deathly hush.
John Peters and John Nichol were in the heart of enemy territory. After 2 hours walking, the inevitable happened.
We saw an Iraqi truck. The Iraqis got out, about 15 of them. You could sort of hear the Arabic on the wind, and they start marching towards us, and we were just lying on flat, open ground. There was nowhere to hide. And you just think, I mean, there's no one's going to save you. No one. It's not the 7th Cavalry, and they got about 100 yards from us. They saw us, and then 15 guys with Kalashnikov machine guns just open up, and you're lying, covering your head, and the bullets are bouncing this far from your head, and it's kicking sand all over your hair, over your back, and these bullets are bouncing over the top of you, and you just sit there, either waiting to be hit or do you fire back, and it's just mayhem. I don't know how they missed. They didn't stop firing until about 20 yards.
The stealth pilots had suffered no casualties at all. Although their plane was almost impossible to detect by Iraqis, many of the men who flew them took extra precautions.
We're very superstitious, so a couple things that I would do is do our combat wallet and make sure it was the same all the time. Well, in that, you'd carry your ID card, you'd carry what we call a pointy talkie, and this is to help you if you go down, and you'd carry a blood chit. So I'd take these and I always stack them, blood chit, pointy talkie, ID card, and I'd stick them into this top pocket right here in my leg. Then I wanted to be just like those folks in World War II were flying around, and I wanted to have a picture of my new wife. I took her picture and I put it with her towards me, and I put it in my upper pocket towards my heart, and I flew all my missions there with her.
As the bombing of Baghdad continued, the world's media gathered to watch. General Schwarzkopf was the star of the show.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
Drew Nichols, who had nervously flown one of the first stealth missions, was now getting used to them.
Hitting a target is very emotionless. There's a lot of emotions on my part, me being hurt or anything like that, but the actual destruction of the target is very, I think, you're very withdrawn from it. You're at an altitude above the target. A couple times I've seen, I saw trucks and cars driving across a bridge that I was blowing up. To me, it was just a target, and it was my job.
It was John Peters' bad luck to be imprisoned in the Iraqi capital on the night of one of Drew Nichols' stealth bombing missions.
We entered Baghdad at night when there was a huge air raid on with bombs going off and anti-aircraft fire, which sort of rattles your bones, really shakes your spine. And within 2 seconds of being shoved in a room in this building, a bomb hit the room, and we were blown across the floor and covered in rubble, and the ceiling came down.
I believe our bombs actually knocked the doors of their cells off the hinges. We weren't aware that POWs were there, but I remember hearing stories from the POWs that was their worst experiences when we were going after that building. They said they knew how accurate we were, and they were afraid that they'd get hurt.
As John Peters began his solitary confinement, training for the ground troops in Saudi Arabia continued in preparation for a ground war that most believed would eventually happen.
It was hammer and tongs. Fitness training twice, sometimes 3 times a day. Weapons training, drills with vehicles, drills as dismounted soldiers. Very, very hard.
we were literally thrashed during training. So we knew we'd need to be tested and we need to be war ready, basically. If we're going to war, we need to be war ready. The commander needs to be happy that you are ready to go to war and fight and maybe die for your country. If you're going to send a soldier that isn't trained, then he has always got the chance of letting himself down, the team down, and the actual battle and the country down.
Objective clear.
It was now over 5 months since the first troops had landed in Saudi Arabia. Training took up fuel, ammunition, and energy.
We trained so hard that several weeks before the attack began, I gathered my commanders together and said, look, let's back off. We have been training so hard. I am worried about our Marines being exhausted from training before they ever begin this thing. So we did. We cut back a little.
There was a great danger of boredom setting in among the ground troops and their morale falling. They wrote endless letters to their families, and just occasionally, on local leave, they could get to a telephone.
I cannot overemphasize how important it was for soldiers to communicate with the people they loved. Curiously, the telephone is not necessarily the best of ways of doing that, because a chap comes out of the desert. Almost the most important thing is he was going to ring up the girlfriend, the wife, the loved one back home. And imagine a long queue, and then he gets to the telephone box and he puts through the telephone call and there's no answer. Or worse still, you know, bizarre example, some bloke the other end who he's never heard of before. And imagine his morale, because the queue is then so long, he's got to get to the back of it or wait till the next day, or worse still, wait another 3 weeks before he gets another shot at the telephone. Not a good way of communicating. Letters much better.
The long wait for action by ground troops meant that fears had had time to develop and fester. Religion became popular.
I pray all the time, whether I was in the war or not. That's just part of my life. During peacetime, you know, if you go to a chapel service, you might have a handful of people. But in the war, the tents were full with Marines that want to get closer to God, that needed that spiritual help and guidance. Probably Christians that maybe just don't go to church very often, but these are people that were there, and I can tell you for a fact that they became real religious because it was a wartime situation and everybody needed something besides just their training to get them through.
Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him.
It was funny, the amount of people that started devil dodging when it all kicked off.
To what God is doing in history.
The Padre, from being a figure that's normally shunned by people, became quite popular. And a number of people were sort of going and speaking to him and taking him off to one side. I'm a Roman Catholic, and I can't say I chased down the Catholic priest to have a chat with him. In my mind, you look after yourself, you know, and by chatting to the Catholic priest or the Padre isn't going to make my performance any better. You don't have to go to a Padre to publicly think that God's going to look after you.
If anyone needed the protection of God, it was John Peters. His Iraqi torturers were trying to prize information out of him.
You could hear the thud as they hit you, and then it's difficult to describe it, but it hurts. But then after a while you get used to they beat a certain part, and that gets really numb. But then they move to another part. They hit you with baseball bats, and that's a certain type of pain, and then they'll kick and thump you and smash your face against the wall. And then they'll hit you with rubber truncheons, which is really like a wheel. It's very sharp pain, and it's just unreal. You can't really remember everything that happened. It just goes on and on and on, and for 4 days you're blindfolded and handcuffed, and you just take it, really.
As the months passed, the fears of the troops who were going to fight the expected ground war became more real. John Mulheron was typical of many.
My biggest worry was becoming a casualty. Not being killed, getting a leg blown off, an arm blown off, something like that, becoming a liability for the rest of my guys to look after me. I felt responsible for all the guys in that section, and I didn't want to let them down. And that was the thing, that if I did get hurt, what would happen in the middle of an attack if I was taken out.
Despite any fears that he had, by now, John Mulheron just wanted to get on with the war and get back home.
When I was out there, I missed having a life, not having a social life, being stuck with the same people day in, day out. Now, fine, they're their comrades, you're your friends, but at times you can't get on top of each other. When you're living in a space 6 foot by 4 foot, you know, for days and days and weeks and months, it can get a little bit irksome. You get all these letters from home, from family, friends, and they'd be describing what they'd been up to and this, that and the other, and that brought it home even more. It was a kick up the arse for us to get everything sorted out and get back.
Even more keen for the war to end was captive pilot John Peters, whom Saddam Hussein was now trying to use to help his propaganda war.
They came along, kicked you awake, took the bag off your head, and you're really quite blinded by the light. Take your metal handcuffs off and your arms start shaking because suddenly you've got real pain as you've got blood in your hands. They then get a pistol out, hit you about the head by the pistol, and then they just put the gun straight right between my eyes, and they pull the hammer back and you can hear everything, and time here really slows down. I mean, you can remember absolutely every little, you can remember the smell, and you can just remember their faces. You had two guys here, and the guy looking me straight at me, and you didn't look at him in the eyes, and you were just looking at this gun. And they said, Peters, you're going on television, or you'll never see your wife and children again.
Most of the captured American and British airmen were forced onto television. Saddam regarded them as his war trophies and wanted to display them.
I think our leaders and our people have wrongly attacked the peaceful people of Iraq.
Peters had little choice but to take part in the recording, but was determined not to cooperate.
I spoke very quietly, so I had to pile the microphone up on the books. Then I got this major, who was quite convincing, slapped me about the face, right up here against my face, and said, "You will do this." And so all I tried to do was not to say the script, and, you know, all my friends did fantastic things in war. The only thing I'm proud of in the fact that I didn't say what they wanted me to say. All I said was I was Flight 10 Peters, I'd bombed an airfield. And I didn't say any of their script.
One of the most telling images of the Gulf War. It personalized the suffering, reminding us that in this high-tech war of long-range killing, old-fashioned thuggery was still at work. Saddam Hussein never even bothered to release what little John Peters said on the broadcast. Nevertheless, Peters' morale fell.
After the TV, however much you think you've given your best shot, you feel really low. I felt very low after that because I thought it was. I thought people would think I was a traitor and weak and had given in.
Almost every night, John Peters heard and felt the Allied bombs as he sat alone in his prison cell. The air campaign continued to soften up Iraq for the ground war. By now, Drew Nichols was a bombing veteran.
Bridges were the best targets to hit. They were the most fun, if there's fun at all. Not to hurt anybody, but they looked the best. The way they fell down and stuff like that. Destroying something that was built so well.
Saddam's military command and supply lines were being systematically destroyed. US Marine Chuck Ingram had been waiting to fight for 5 months. The pressure was mounting, and like most of his colleagues, Chuck was desperate to see action.
We were itching for a fight. Some people may find this crazy at the time, but we actually prayed. It was part of the bravado, I guess, that you have to come up with in order to go do something like this. We would actually pray for war. We'd say, let it happen.
26-year-old Chuck Ingram's wish was about to be granted.
On the evening of January 29th, 1991, is when war came into Chuck Ingram's life.
Three weeks before the ground war began, Iraqi troops made a preemptive strike across the border into the Saudi Arabian town of Al-Khafji. The attack took the Allies by surprise. Although the town had been evacuated, Saudi territory had been captured. 2 reconnaissance teams of US Marines were hiding in the town. One was led by Chuck Ingram.
They owned the town. They just came through like a May Day parade, hatches open, totally unopposed, totally unaware that we were there watching. We believed we were seeing the beginnings of Saddam Hussein's, quote, mother of all battles.
The Marines had had the chance to escape at the beginning of the invasion. Instead, they had decided to stay and hold themselves up in a bombed-out building.
My initial reaction was that we should go. I didn't voice this, but I was the actual team leader, and you have people's lives in your hand. Our corpsman came up to me and said, "We're Marines." And for me, that's when I made the decision, we're staying.
By now, the Iraqi troops were uncomfortably close to Chuck and his team.
The Iraqis were in the building with us and didn't know we were there. Quite luckily, they didn't come up the stairs. But you could look out the stairwell, and if you wanted to, you could spit on their helmets. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. So there was quite a bit of time there for us to see what was going on and literally think this was our last day on the planet.
But a few miles away in the desert was the Marine artillery backup. They could talk to Chuck by radio.
Roger out. It was about 40 minutes ago, sir, when they were requesting rules of engagement because they had a possible target.
As a television news camera recorded the bombardment, Chuck and the other Marines told the artillery precisely where the Iraqi positions in Al-Khafji were.
Once you let them know where they're firing, that stuff comes in. If you're within 600 yards, there's a possibility that that round could stray and hit you.
Chuck was so near to the Iraqi troops that he was forced to call in artillery dangerously close to himself and his men.
We didn't call anything further out than 300 yards. We called stuff in across the street, less than 50 meters away. Artillery won't adjust anything less than 50 meters because the guns just aren't that accurate. In a sense, we called stuff in on ourselves. When the artillery would come in, it was such a display of power that it really made you feel like you had some sort of supernatural power, that you're calling this stuff in, and it was a very, very, it was a rush. It was such a high. And it was a feeling of being invincible. It was a feeling of having your big brother come down the street and beat the hell out of the bully that's been tormenting you. It made you feel good.
In the middle of the battle for Al-Khafji, a US Army truck was driving through the desert to the south of the town. The woman driver tried to give her 3 male colleagues directions. They ignored her.
I stopped the trucks and I told them we needed to take that exit. They refused to listen to me. They said that I didn't know where I was going. I had not been on any missions, and that they knew where they were going. We had to go straight. We saw the Persian Gulf off to our right, and I told them we weren't supposed to see that, but they didn't want to hear me. And we drove past about 200 Marines to over on the right on the hill and came right into Kavji.
Melissa's colleagues soon wished they had listened to her directions.
The Iraqis got off a lucky shot that hit our steering box and knocked our steering out, and thus we rolled forward into a wall. The Iraqis were coming up from our left, so we started to run up the inside of a wall. There was a huge mansion-like house that we were trying to get to, but they surrounded us with AK-47s, pistols, and everything, and they told us to get down.
Marine Captain John Borth was dispatched to find Melissa.
They weren't in the vehicle. The tires were spinning, deuce gear was in there, but they weren't in the vehicle. We don't know if they fled or were captured.
When we set up a secure position around the vehicle, we found out they weren't there. Deuce gear was laying everywhere. The rear tires on the vehicle were still spinning. I, at that time, requested permission to continue my search into the town, but was ordered not to go into the town.
John Borth's search for Melissa was called off because by now Chuck Ingram, oblivious to Melissa's plight, was calling in air support from U.S. Marine Harriers.
Captain Greg Bogard put his weapons right across the column. I remember he hit their fuel truck because the explosion was tremendous and it blocked out the targets I was going for when it finally went out. So I put my rockeye through the clouds that he'd just left. The rockeye was designed to be an anti-tank weapon. It's a cluster munition that holds 247 bomblets inside of it. We would release them 2 at a time in a pattern that would basically devastate a football field and even 2 or 3 football fields.
As they were walking us back, an air raid began. We heard a huge explosion. We thought our truck had blown up. We found out after the fact that it was the house we were trying to get to that had been blown up in the air raid.
The Iraqis had paid a heavy price for their invasion of Al-Kafji. Many had been killed, their hardware destroyed by the artillery and airstrikes called in by Chuck Ingram and his team. With Iraqi forces in disarray, Chuck made his move.
As we ran down the last street, we could see freedom 500 yards away. We knew we would be safe if we got out there. I just said, go, go. Because one thing I learned while we were there is action will always beat inaction.
Only afterwards did Chuck have time to think about his feelings during the battle.
There are a lot of emotions going through you. Initially, I experienced fear, and then it just became a calm, and I was able to think clearly. And although you could see people in armored personnel carriers that were actually burning, they were already dead, but their bodies were burning. Tank battles are going on right outside your building. Stray rounds are falling on the building. You've had a tank with its machine gun actually shoot at you, and the round goes straight through the center block wall in front of you. It just really doesn't sink in. I really think it's the adrenaline.
I feel proud that I did my job, but I was scared to death. Honest truth, scared to death.
3 days after the incident, I started crying uncontrollably. Not a type of boo-hoo crying, but my body heaved. And I really wasn't thinking of anything in particular at that moment. It just happened.
By now, Melissa Rathbun-Neely was on her way to Baghdad. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she could imagine what might.
It took about 2 days for them to get us from Kafji up to Baghdad. We rode in dump trucks, we rode in buses, we rode in jeeps. At one point during our transportation to Baghdad, one soldier, Iraqi soldier, attempted to fondle me. And I made the decision then that I would rather die than to be violated. And I had my arm across my chest because it was wounded. They had put a sling-like on it. And he continued to bother me, and I reached across with my left arm and I punched him in the arm. And he pulled out a gun, and his superiors who were in the front seat turned around and told him no. And that's where it ended, but I would rather die than be violated, and that was my decision. So luckily I made the right one.
Al-Kafji was retaken after 2 days. And Saudi troops were given the privilege of being the first to go back in. The ground war now loomed, and the Al-Kafji episode had given the Allied officers a valuable insight into the Iraqis' fighting strength.
Kafji was a boost of our morale because we retook that town with the Saudis and the Qatari forces. So that made us know at that time that this so-called formidable foe, fourth largest army in the world, could be defeated. Up until that time, our intelligence was saying that we were going to have a tough time and that there would be many casualties. But that Kafji fight told our leaders, told our troops that this was a destructible force that we could not easily take, but certainly win.
From an intelligence perspective, it was good for me. We learned that the Iraqis could not move, shoot, communicate at the same time. Once this attack began, it became sort of disjointed and wasn't conducted very well. So that was something we were pleased to see. Maybe most important, we learned that if they got their nose bloodied in round one, I mean, if you were able to hurt them and they took casualties, they seemed very reluctant to come back for any more.
From the first sorties on the night of January the 17th until the end of the war, the Allied bombers flew over 100,000 missions, dropping nearly 90,000 tons of ordnance on Iraq. 291 cruise missiles were launched against targets that required pinpoint accuracy. The Allies had set great store by smart weapons and their concentration on military targets. But on the 13th of February 1991, 2 laser-guided bombs destroyed a bunker containing Iraqi civilians, many of them women and children. 314 were killed, and the incident gave Saddam Hussein a chance to claim the moral high ground. The Iraqis claimed that the bunker was merely a shelter for innocent civilians. The Allies, that it was a legitimate military target.
It's not true! What kind of military situation that they are talking about? Where is it? Where is it? Just tell me, where is it after that all?
Although it emerged that the bunker probably had been used for military purposes, for once, General Schwarzkopf seemed rattled.
We're not indiscriminately targeting civilian targets, and I think that the very action of the Iraqis themselves demonstrate that they know damn well that we're not attacking civilian targets. Since right now they've dispersed their airplanes into residential areas, they've moved their headquarters into schools. Under the Geneva Convention, that gives us a perfect right to go after those things if we wanted to, and we haven't done it.
The bombing of the bunker brought the Allies a public relations disaster. Despite this, their raids continued. Coalition airstrikes had destroyed much of Iraq's military capability and infrastructure, but Saddam Hussein's troops still occupied Kuwait. After 5 months of waiting, It was almost time for the coalition ground troops to fight. They were ready.
When my troops heard and got the mission, they were just ready to go. And the bottom line was we couldn't get in there and do the job fast enough.
Exhilaration's the main thing that I felt when we were warned off and we knew we were going to war. We're having a chance to go to work, to put into practice everything that we trained for. And apprehension, yes, huge adrenaline rush, a little bit of terror thrown in.
You just get this feeling of, yes, it's going to be over soon. We're going to be out of here. By then, you know, my unit had been on the ground 6 months in the desert, and we were just itching to go. We were ready to, you know, go to Baghdad and go home.
The air campaign had come to an end. From now on, the planes will be used as air support for the ground invasion of Iraq and the retaking of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's grasp.